Hi, this is Paul. Does Jordan Peterson have a plan yet? Whenever I do a video like this, a bunch of people get defensive for him. And go right ahead if you want to, but this is what I think about when I watch him because I don't know. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. And I'll give you my thoughts on this. We're now into the second wave. The wave burst on us pretty quickly from his, January. It started December, November, January. It really started to build. And if just from my YouTube front page, there's all sorts of videos out there. Jordan on usually about six-figure sub-level YouTube accounts that are sort of culturally aligned for him. The first wave was really October 2016 to June 2019, and he may not be back 100%. He told Jonathan Peugeot 5%. Wow, wait for 100%. But he's putting out content like crazy in terms of the number of interviews he's doing. And so it's a good time to sort of look at tactics and strategy from what I can see. Just a little bit of review. I think the heart of his mission is to rescue individuals from the meaning crisis. He admonishes people to take responsibility, make goals, clean up your room, do what you can to make your life better, and you will make your life better. And if individuals do this, the world will be better. Do what's meaningful and not what's expedient. And asked in the first wave, what was the most important of his first 12 rules? That's the one he would often mention, and I think that one is closest to the heart of what his mission is, partly because for a long time, even before his wife was really in distress, it would be those kinds of questions that would lead him to break down, and people would come to him on the streets and tell him how much he's meant to them and really help them change their life. He's been a clinical psychologist. He's a teacher, or at least he was those things. And so that really, I think, if you want to look at what the heart of his life mission is, if he were to sit down and write a mission statement for his life, this, I think, is the heart of his mission. Now, when you talk tactics and strategies for Peterson in terms of if he has a plan, what his plan would be, wave number one obviously was cut short by both his wife's illness and his own. But throughout wave number one, I kept coming back to the same point about institutions and organizations. He did not build a meaningful organization to support his individual quest. A friend on the Discord channel found the Billy Graham Museum down in North Carolina and visited it, and then he shared with me some of his insights from that. I often think about Billy Graham with respect to Jordan Peterson, not so much in terms of the alignment of the message, or even sort of the alignment of the mission, but in terms of the dynamics between the big audience crusade and the development of individual lives. Billy Graham, in the middle of the 20th century, was an enormous cultural movement. Jordan Peterson is a big deal, but Billy Graham filled stadiums. Billy Graham traveled the world, and Billy Graham really set the template for the modern evangelical crusade, where the big name speaker comes into town, but a year or two before that event would happen, the Billy Graham organization would mobilize all of the churches so that when Billy Graham did come to town, the churches were all ready, and the churches would basically do support for picking up, really connecting with all of the individuals that Billy Graham would catch the attention of. Part of the problem of Jordan Peterson's mission is that, and I know this as a pastor because in some ways pastors are in this business, you can energize and mobilize and get people to think in a new way with a sermon or a speech or a movie, but so much more life is in the follow-through. And a book can't sustain the follow-through. What you really need is some sort of small group. Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, would not have worked without local groups. The local groups do the majority of carrying for people in terms of the accountability, the friendships, the relationships, the day-to-day sorting out. Jordan comes through and gives people a lot of big ideas, but where do those big ideas go? basically that's what I saw almost immediately when I saw this wave swelling in the first wave. And one of his rules in the second book really applies to a lot of what I've done. Notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Now, in all fairness to Jordan, I don't think he expected the first big wave, but now that he's done it once, he should understand what the second wave will mean. And okay, so you can sell a lot of books, you can get on a lot of YouTube channels, and all of that can happen, but if you're not really developing an institution or a structure, many people who get mobilized and energized and inspired by a book or an event or something like that, they'll just regress back to the mean. They're not going to be able to make meaningful change in their life unless they are surrounded usually with a small group of people or a smallish institution that can essentially keep things going. And in the first wave of Jordan Peterson's work, a bunch of people sort of got interested in church and Bible studies, and there were a whole bunch of meetups that got going, but most of those meetups at this point have probably dissipated, and 5 years from the initial moment of inspiration, people will sort of be back to their old habits, because these old habits are really a function of the much larger system. If you really want to change your life, most people, not all, there's always a few exceptions out there, most people have to rearrange the habits of their lives, because our lives are much more shaped by our habits than our aspirations. And so if you want meaningful long-term life change, you have to change your habits. And generally speaking, the only way you can change your habits is by changing your community. To look at Jonathan Haidt's rider and the elephant metaphor, the rider can have all sorts of great aspirational ideas, but unless the elephant gets retrained, it doesn't really matter what the rider is saying about himself or wants to do with the elephant in the future. You have to change the path, as Haidt said. So what can we see so far in wave 2? Well, not much. It's just the beginning of the wave. But, rule number 7, Jordan seems to be following for himself. Work as hard as possible. Work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. And so what he's doing right now, it seems, is doubling down on, getting the word out by the book tour, getting back on YouTube, and doing some of that. And it's not a bad strategy. Everywhere Jordan goes, he's going to be spiking everybody's YouTube analytics, getting everybody excited, but all of those people see Jordan sort of in their own mind, and because Jordan, his work is so multifaceted, everybody sort of sees the facet that they're interested in. So for some people, Jordan is a religious figure. For other people, Jordan is someone on the life, a life coach, a self-help book. That came up during the that one interview that I made a video on earlier. So all of this is tentative, what's going on right now, because you can have a video that gets 1 million views in the first 2-3 weeks, and a year from now, hardly anyone will find it. That's the way YouTube goes. YouTube is just such a massive thing. If you really want to do long-term change in people's lives, you need to figure out how to create groups of people that can continue to change each other. This, in many ways, is part of the secret of Christianity, because this group dynamic was built into Christianity right from the start. So everything so far in terms of wave 2 is tentative. And it's amazing he's gotten so much out of the gate so fast. He may very well have big plans, but he certainly isn't talking about them. He's clearly not afraid of big plans, but there were a number of things in wave number 1 that never came to pass, and some of them looked a little sketchy. There was an MBA program, I think it was, that promised a lot of Jordan Peterson attention and Jordan Peterson contact, and there was a hubbub over that because they didn't seem to have his time, and plus, Jordan's all over the place. He's always got other things working behind the scenes. That much is obvious. He's made sort of a business out of figuring out who you are and your self-authoring program, and the ThinkSpot thing is out there, and how much focus and attention any of these things have. I think part of this, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, part of this is Jordan Peterson pretty much working all of this as a family business. And that, I think, is showing some of the real limitations of the strategy that he's worked so far. Well, let's see, where are we next? Okay, the book promotion. Books are powerful tools. You can get a message out into a lot of people's hands. The first 12 Rules for Life was an enormous bestseller, basically translated into all of the languages that others get translated into. But again, self-help books are just that. They're self-help books. And I know plenty of people that if you walk into their house, their shelves are lined with self-help books. Well, what's the difference between reading a self-help book and actually changing your life? Again, back to Jonathan Haidt. It's about retraining the elephant. And in order to retrain the elephant, you either change the path, really both and change the herd. Again, Peterson has a lot of background in alcohol recovery. He knows this. If you're a drug addict and all of your friends, usually all of your friends are drug addicts. If you want to no longer be a drug addict, you're going to have to find new friends. Same thing goes for Christian conversion. If you become a Christian, you're going to need to make Christian friends. Now, this is one of the issues that churches have in becoming so insular, because very quickly you only have Christian friends. And that's in some ways really helpful for the growth of your own Christian discipleship, but it makes it difficult to connect with your non-Christian friends because very quickly you start speaking different languages. So the book promotion and the book tour will be a big part of this, and fair enough. That's what the publishers are banking on. Peterson's going to make millions of dollars more on his second book, and I don't begrudge him a single penny of this. It's a good thing he had all those millions from the first wave because he needed it for going to Russia and having to basically survive everything they survived. There's a fair amount of insight into the first wave from the Michaela Peterson, Tammy Peterson conversation. I remember early, it was in, I think, one of the films, the third-party films that came out around Jordan Peterson, that had a clip of Tammy basically saying, "We've lost Jordan." And I could very much understand from her perspective seeing him basically carried out by this wave, and she very wisely said, if he's not going to go and I'm not going to be left behind and the family destroyed, because that's usually the pattern, I've got to ride this wave with him. And so she did. And there's also a lot of wisdom in that video, because both she and Michaela noted, no, we're not going to do 135 cities in 150 days. That's not wise. And hopefully they can sort of rein Jordan in on some of these things, but just little subtle indications from the household. Tammy's got a fair amount of influence, but it sort of looks like Jordan gets what he wants most of the time. I don't know. I don't want to presume. I'm just a pastor, and I look at a lot of households, and I look at little tells, and I think Jordan gets what he wants a lot of time. I think Tammy, some of the things she's also said in some of these interviews, it sounds like she's got a little bit stronger no to him now and can draw some lines, and we'll see how that unfolds. But part of this has been sort of Peterson's ink. In the first wave, Michaela was sort of Jordan's publicist, and then of course he signed on with that big promotional place that really lined up the book tour, because obviously, getting all the venues set up, this is something that you really need a large corporation. They already have the networks built up. They already know exactly the venues in every major city to go to. They know how to run the big machine. And so in wave one, Peterson Inc. was sort of wedded to that big machine, and it ran, and it almost killed them. Now, they still seem to sort of run things like a family. If you look at the Jordan Peterson's conversation with the artist, he's working with the publishers, but It's Peterson Inc. And there are upsides to that and downsides to that. I think the upside for that is probably the marriage has survived and potentially strengthened through this. That's a really important thing, because if the marriage hadn't survived wave one, oh, we would have seen drama, because you got to know there'd be all sorts of there would be a messy divorce, and there'd be money fighting over, and then there would be Jordan Peterson's dating life, and someone comes along and wants to do a reality series of single Jordan Peterson. I mean, I am so glad that Tammy had the wherewithal and the wisdom to say, if this wave's going, I'm riding with you. I'm sure it saved their marriage and saved both of their lives, quite frankly. So it's a good thing that the family has stayed intact. But this is going to be an issue in the second wave, just like it was in the first wave. And now you've got the additional questions of, okay, how does this work with Jordan's health? Is this lion diet, is this all meat carnivore diet sustainable over the very long term? We have no idea. How will Jordan's mood be over the long term? We have no idea. What will Jordan do in terms of his mood and pharmaceuticals? We have no idea. And it's fine that we have no idea. All that is private information, but that is going to pan out in terms of what happens with them going forward. And part of the downside of being Peterson's Inc. is that, well, how much other wisdom can you build into the system? Okay? So again, the doctor who is his own doctor has a fool for a doctor. The lawyer who is his own lawyer has a fool for a lawyer. And then some of this gets onto what Jonathan Peugeot was talking about with Jordan with respect to a covering. And that's a word that's also used in Pentecostal circles, so it's very interesting. But are there other wise people that will speak into Jordan's life? Now, at the first part of wave number one, Jordan made a big point of that he had other close, trusted friends who are speaking into his life. But I don't know how strongly they spoke into it, because it doesn't seem like a hard thing to say, 135 cities in 150 days is not a sustainable plan. And that they know now, whether nobody had the guts to tell Jordan that, or he wouldn't listen to it. My sense is, again, when Jordan wants something, he goes for it single-mindedly. And there's no question about his deep love for his wife or her deep love for him. And, part of me is really warmed and thrilled at seeing at least the family together, but families in some ways were not designed for this level of business activity. I, as a pastor, have seen a number of family businesses, none of them ever attempting anything at this scale. This whole thing is a very tricky proposition, and there are 1,000 ways for things to go wrong. Now, Jordan is quite gun-shy with the mass media, and that makes perfect sense. Who wouldn't be after the way that he's treated? But for all the chatter of the decline of mass media that Jordan and Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan and many like to talk, mass media remains the gatekeeper. Mass media remains the validator. And almost anyone, not all, but almost anyone who is genuinely huge on social media has had a leg up in mass media. So Matthew McConaughey just started a YouTube channel, and it'll be over 100,000 subscribers in just a few days. So that's just a reality. And so his deciding to sort of swear off mass media, I don't know if that's sustainable or can last. Wave number one would never have accelerated without it. Wave number one did accelerate because this story of this strange psychology professor at the University of Toronto bucking non-gender pronouns, that hit the media, And that's what launched Jordan. So even though he, of course, had done a lot of time in social media, his wave was fueled by mass media. And again, nothing fuels attention like conflict. And so that's part of what keeps it going too. Now there's a serious principality level power to contend with when it comes to mass media. This is in many ways the dominant religion of our context. And this is the area where his physical recovery will probably most hold him back. Now, there is a win-loss dynamic with mass media. Again, he's probably wise to try to avoid them, but he's dealing with a major publisher. At that level, the major publisher really wants him to engage with mass media, and that's how the Times interview came about. Now, you probably can't reach the kind of heights given what I imagine his strategy to be. Mass media actually works quite deeply in terms of his individual sort of evangelical-like crusade. You know, remember the conversations he had with Dr. Oz. Is he going to go back to Dr. Oz? Is he going to go on Oprah? Just look at the Harry and Meghan drama that's going on right now. I mean, mass media is in many ways the constellation of the gods and the heavenlies for our culture today. Now, I come back to what one of my local meetup guys said is Jordan Peterson needs to keep on getting into fights. Now, Jordan, quite understandably, has said, I don't like getting into these fights. And I totally understand that. But these fights are what fueled his status rocket ride in the first place, partly because he kept coming out of them so well. And that includes the Times article. Certainly is true of Kathy Newman. Certainly is true of the British GQ interview. Many of these things, the Vice interview, enforced monogamy, all of these things, Jordan gets into them, but in almost every case, these fights are what help him pursue what seems to me to be the strategy that he's pursuing. You know, the reputational hit job certainly had a profound impact, but this is still quite a mass media fueled movement. A haunting question in a lot of this is, what if he's played out? There's the map territory dynamic. What do I mean by that? Is all of us tend to repeat ourselves, and generally speaking, especially if you're looking for scale and not depth necessarily in a person. Now, everybody of course wants both, but if you're looking for scale, what that means is you have to repeat yourself again and again and again and again and again and again and again. You have to keep repeating. You know, it's just like the big rock bands. You can go to Tahoe or Reno and Vegas, and you can see the names of rock bands from the 60s and 70s, and you can go there, and there may or may not be even one person from the original band. The label now owns the name, and you'll go there and you'll find a bunch of fine musicians singing the old songs. And they keep singing that song again and again and again. You can find plenty of rock music songs that sing about this. It's because everybody wants to hear the hit again. Because when the hit first hit someone, they experienced it, and it was transformation, and they keep going back to the well for it. So they want to hear Jordan Peterson talk about the Lobsters, and they want to hear Jordan Peterson own the Libs, and they want to hear Jordan Peterson with all of his great takedowns and yada yada. And YouTube, of course, fuels that, but they want to see Jordan do it live. And this is part of the role that Dave Rubin played in the book tour, is that Dave Rubin sort of primed up the crowd along all of those culture war areas, and then Jordan went out and sort of went on about what exactly he decided he was going to talk about that evening. And when Tammy talked about, sort of their pattern on the road, well, he would think about, okay, spend an hour or two thinking about what he wanted to talk about. Then he would go on stage and talk about it. Now, why did he do that and not a standard book tour? Well, I completely understand. People often, let's say if I get sick one week or maybe get busy one week, people will say, well, why don't you repeat a sermon? Well, there have been very few times, especially since I've been back in North America, there have been very few times in the 20 plus years that I've been preaching in North America that I ever repeat a sermon, and almost never to my local church. Why not? It's not because they would remember the sermon so much or they couldn't stand to hear it again. It's because I get bored with it. And so part of what that means is that there's a repetition issue that's going to happen with Jordan. And so I've listened to some of these recent YouTube interviews that he's doing, and, well, it's the map territory dynamic. I hear some of the same things I've heard before, and maybe new little insight, but the signal to noise ratio in terms of the fresh information versus the old information, it's kind of small, so then I'll listen to them at high speed, or I'll just kind of skip through them. And often what I do now is, because of this channel, if I trust in many of you that if he says something new in one of these interviews, I don't have to go out and fish for it anymore. You all will look for it, and you'll say, oh, you've got to listen to this section over here in this talk, and then I'll listen to it, and then it might show up in a video, and that's sort of the way this food chain works. So this is what will probably go on, and this is kind of the you'll get a dynamic of diminishing returns. He can go on a lot of YouTube. He can go on a lot of YouTube channels and sort of have to repeat himself again and again and again and again. And each YouTube audience will have sort of a particular take. I watched some of the trigonometry interview, and so each one will sort of have their take. They're usually somewhat aligned to him in terms of his cultural agenda, but that alone will make it less interesting, because he's not talking to people who are going to challenge him or push him, and he's not going to have to dig deep and pull something out. And I think that was in some ways part of the death of the book tour, or let's say the decadence of the book tour videos. And you can find them. They taped them, they recorded them, and he's put them out on his podcast, but nobody is really pushing him, because that's not the setup. And again, a lot of the pushing he gets from the mass media, which is why the mass media stuff is so potent and why the mass media stuff does so well. And so this really sort of creates a ceiling on his growth potential. And it's why, where I want to go with this video, is why institutions matter. Because what institutions afford is sort of a broadening and a stabilizing, which allows sort of the institution to carry a lot of the repetitions that you need in order for a movement to grow broader, but allows the founder to keep doing his own work, which allows him to go deeper. And so while the institution is sort of broadening the movement, the founder of the institution can deepen, because the movement is energized by the founder finding new things, being refreshed and renewed. And again, I look at this analogous to what it's like to be a preacher. One of the things that happens often, especially when you're training young preachers, is they're all excited and they have their first sermon, and after they give their first sermon, they don't know what to do in their second sermon, because they've been sitting on that sermon like an egg for a very long time, and whoop, there it hatched. Now it's done. Is that all you got? Because next week they want more. And so then you're always working on, and again, Peterson, nobody talks about this Peterson better than Peterson. You're always working on this chaos and order dynamic, map territory, new territory, and you're always right in there. And so what the preacher has to do is keep working on him or herself. And keep working on, look for new things. And this is part of the reason, I'm always studying other things. I'm always reading books. It keeps me fresh, because if I get bored with myself, my audience is going to be very bored with me indeed. So you have to keep doing that work yourself. And part of the problem, if you don't have an institution around you that allows you to broaden yourself and doesn't get you bored and boring by all the repetition, you're not going to have time to do the main work. One of the people that I learned some of this from was Bill Hybels. Bill Hybels, I think probably his best book was his book on leadership. Well, he wrote a lot of books on leadership, but one chapter in that book, he said, the pastor should be putting 70% of their energy into self-leadership. Now, this was a guy with a church of thousands. Well, why would he? And I remember when he said that number, I think it was in one of his tapes. And I thought, wow, I might have said 25 or 30, but you're saying 70. And I know Hybels, has had some things in the news about some of his issues, but what he accomplished, well, basically what he did, he and Rick Warren, let's say, was that they managed to seed the seeker movement. And what they did was create a movement that reshaped, for better and worse, churches all around the world. That required, according to Hybels, 70% of his time devoted to self-leadership. He needed to stay fresh. He needed to stay right there at that place between chaos and order, and really, in order to not simply have the movement stall. And that's, in a lot of ways, what I fear will happen to Peterson. And I've heard this almost from the start, from people that have known him, former students, former colleagues, people that have listened to him for years, and they basically say, when he comes on the scene, it's pow, it's fresh. It's like nothing you've ever heard, but after a while, you've heard it all. And then you're off to new territory. And so in other words, for Peterson to not just become a has-been, he's going to have to figure out how to stay fresh. And by virtue of how this works in YouTube land, he's going to have to keep having conversations with people with whom he doesn't necessarily agree, and even people with whom there are reasons to imagine that there's an adversarial relationship. And I think it's for this reason that his religious conversations, this is one of the reasons his religious conversations are his cutting edge. Just looked at his conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, and 1.4 million views so far. In terms of the conversations that he's had, that's a lot. And I remember going to a Rick Warren conference back in the late 90s, and I remember Rick Warren, again, people don't recognize how big some of these guys are, like Rick Warren. Just look at the sales of Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life. And again, 12 Rules for Life, big book. Purpose-Driven Life, bigger. The personal is the powerful, and Rick Warren is very right about that. The spiritual religious is your ceiling. You really can't evolve beyond the limitations of your religious or spiritual system. And this is why I think part of the reason we have interest in Jordan, as he sort of keeps pushing this, and I don't know that anybody pushed him, even though it didn't look like Jonathan was pushing him, not in the way, let's say, Kathy Newman was pushing him, because this Jordan Peterson is reaching out this way himself. Jordan Peterson keeps saying, well, the archetypal is the thing that you can't get around because it's the biggest thing. And that's right. And both he and Sevilla had made the point that, to me, that, well, not to me, Peterson, but Sevilla had made that point to me. And a lot of therapists reach that the therapeutic will only get you so far. It's the religious that really is the totalizing map. And you have to show progress in this, or again, the audience will get bored. And so, the religious ceiling, the secular ceiling, is at play at a lot of different levels. One of the big takeaways from the marriage crisis conversation that we had was the inadequacy of well-being as a substitute for virtue. I think that's right. And I think virtue shoots beyond this world, and religious language takes over. And I think this is actually one of the real issues with the IDW. With, in many ways, Brett and Eric Eric coined the IDW, and in some ways they still are. Peterson, I think, exemplifies it far more than anyone else. But Brett and Eric are sort of the torch holders. And their Game B scenarios are always limited by humanity must be preserved. What is terrifying for them is that the truth is, which they should understand, that humanity must evolve. Well, what does that mean? Well, humanity has been evolving in the storyverse space, and that has to continue. Their plan is to sort of like not wanting the teenager to grow up. That, well, this thing right now is what we should preserve. Well, salvation requires a maturing of humanity. Now, you got to be really careful with that language, because that language can go in a lot of different ways. But there's a deciding, Brett's deciding to transcend is sort of a cheap cheat, really, in a lot of ways. The Terminators don't just decide not to be Terminators anymore. And this is exactly why institutions matter, and the lack of institutionality in Jordan's thinking. The more he works, the more it will become immediately obvious. As, even though I'm not in any league with Jordan Peterson, I have an institution, both specifically and also metaphorically and historically and culturally, that I invest into. And of course, there's huge problems with institutions. There always are. But you can't live with them, and you can't grow without them. You really can't. And so you have to figure that out. And the only way he's actually going to be able to level up is if he really looks at this. And maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't know. But we haven't seen signs of it. And maybe, a lot of people like to keep these things under wraps until there's a big reveal, and fine. And I'll be happily proven wrong. But if his mission is to help individuals, the individuals are going to need more structure around them. And Jordan Peterson can't even have a private practice anymore. Never mind help millions and millions of people as individuals without there being a mediating structure. And again, pastors know this, because even in a church of 100 people, you need mediating structures, because the pastor can't care for everyone. And that's why churches have regular worship services, they have small groups, they have all of these institutions and habits all around them. The culture knows that. I mean, almost any sort of massive social project institutionalizes around them. Only together in an organized way can people continue to level up. Collaboration, cooperation, and productive competition is our superhero as a species. Religious institutions facilitate this. They organize it beyond our individual capacities. And so if look at, let's compare John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. John the Baptist was a mega movement, but it all surrounded John the Baptist. And John the Baptist died and was beheaded, and then his movement actually survived a couple of centuries in an atmosphere that was far less crowded and far slower than our environment today. Jordan Peterson, his movement could wither in his own lifetime. And I know those who have this magical moment and experience of epiphany and transformation say, no, it won't. You can find a lot of people out there that have already ridden the Jordan Peterson train and gotten off. That's because it's a train of one guy trying to do one thing in one way. I don't care how good your thing is. That's not how human beings are. Again, the rider has lots of aspirations. You have to train the elephant, and you train the elephant by changing the path and training a herd with the elephant so they all seek together. That's how human beings work. So I think individual celebrity has a ceiling. It just does. It offers the potential for growth through scale, but again, you have all of these reasons why at a certain point it's tougher and tougher to scale. Does Jordan Peterson really want to be basically Journey or Chicago or any of these bands from the 70s or 80s that are always on tour? The thing is, because it's an individual celebrity, you can't even swap him out. I mean, even those bands that are now playing or that are basically tribute bands with the licensed original name, even they can swap out musicians. If you're an individual celebrity, you can't do it. You have to think about institutions. You have to figure that out that way. So wave 2 is just beginning, and we'll see if it's higher. May or may not be. Maybe broader and slower. That's not a bad thing. That's what happens with waves. Might be longer. Might be you had the big wave, and then the second wave is smaller, and then there'll be a third wave is smaller. We don't know. If it stalls, you can't really surf it. And that's what, I live in California. You ever watch surfers? A really big wave, there's just energy. You just ride that energy, and then when the energy's gone, you just fall off the board. You just sink into the wave, or you jump off, or what have you. Can we use these new tools? How do these new tools fit into this wave? Can old institutions find new life? That's obviously the perpetual question of the church. Very old institution. Can the old tools and wisdom and new tools be brought together to continue to evolve and produce? And for a local church pastor who has a YouTube channel, these are very much my questions. And, I'm learning a lot from Jordan. You always have to learn a lot from all over the place. But in terms of Jordan, I don't know. So if I haven't annoyed you with me, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know your opinion.